All right, it's time to get to some actual content, some real chemistry ideas. And because this is a general chemistry course, the best place to start is probably with atoms. As you know, chemistry is the science of atoms and molecules largely. At least that's the scale of matter that we talk about, right? If you look up chemistry in a dictionary, it usually says it's the science of matter. But atoms and molecules are the distant scale that we chemists are most fond of. All right, so let's talk about atoms. So an atom is the smallest particle of a chemical element that still knows it's that element, is one way to put this, right? It retains all the chemical properties of that element. That's a fancier way to say that. Essentially, if I take a sample of an element, where an element is any of the things that appear in the periodic table, suppose I just had a block of copper, right? If I start dividing that block of copper in half, and I just keep doing that over and over again, eventually I'd come to a division where at least one of the two pieces that I cut off of there would be just one atom, right? I'd get either two one-atom pieces, or I'd get a 1 and a 2, depending on how my splitting had gone in my thought experiment, right? That one copper atom still knows it's a copper atom. If I do the right experiments on it or ask it the right questions, then it can still tell me, yes, this is copper, okay? A central idea, perhaps the central idea of chemistry, is that everything around us, matter, is made up of atoms, okay? I suppose I should say that by saying matter that is at least as large as a hydrogen atom, right? Because I still have matter if I have a proton, but everything that is macroscopic, at least around us, is made up of atoms. Okay, that's true if I go down to submicroscopic scales, right? So if I think about atoms and molecules, I'm on a smaller distance scale there than sort of a standard optical microscope, right? So I could go to distances on the order of nanometers or somewhere around there, and I would still be able to say that everything around me is comprised of atoms. Right. These are some images showing atomic resolution of different things, okay? And so this is always fun for me, because when I first learned about chemistry and took a course like this, I would have been taught that atoms were sort of unimaginably small and there was no possible way you could ever, quote, see them. This really is sort of cheating in the category of seeing, because this is not seeing in an optical kind of sense. But nonetheless, both of those pictures do have images of single atoms. The one on the left of the screen is a collection of xenon atoms bound to a very cold surface of platinum, okay? Each one of those little blue mountains there represents a xenon atom, and the gray background represents a very smooth, atomically smooth platinum surface, okay? You can see that the blue dots there, the xenon atoms, spell out IBM, and that's certainly a clue that that image was created by people who worked for IBM, who were some of the earliest practitioners of a technique known as scanning tunneling microscopy, okay? The STM, or scanning tunneling microscope, as it says over there, is a device that can take images with atomic resolution. Now, images is sort of a broadly used term here, right? What happens here is that a wire with a very fine tip is scanned across the surface of that piece of platinum, and a current actually flows between the tip of that wire and the surface, even though they're not in direct contact, okay? That's the tunneling part. It actually goes across a gap there, okay? Where the xenon atoms are, they'll sit up higher than where the platinum atoms are down below. And so the amount of current that flows between the surface and that tip will be different if it's above the top of one of those xenon atoms or if it's in the space in between. And that's how it maps out that image. Some software then takes the current measurements and turns them into the picture that we're seeing there, does the color choice and all that, okay? Oddly enough, that same scanning tunneling microscope in this case was used to pick up and deposit those xenon atoms where they wanted them, because you could imagine it would take an infinitely long time for a collection of atoms to just randomly spell out IBM on the surface of your platinum metal, okay? Where it says very cold there, by the way, that surface is in contact with a container with liquid helium in it, which sits at a temperature of about 4 Kelvin. I forgot to write down what that is in Fahrenheit or Celsius, but it's very, very cold, okay? The one on the right is one that, gosh, in some ways is more practically useful. It's an atomic resolution image of the surface of a silicon crystal. And you can see it's got a fairly complicated looking structure there with various rings of silicon atoms. Those images are of interest to people that work with silicon, which includes a lot of people in the semiconductor industry, as you might imagine. And this technique, this microscopy, helped a lot of folks figure out the details of what the atomic arrangements at surfaces are. Okay, it's interesting because the atoms on the surface of a crystal often arrange themselves in a different pattern than the atoms that are in the body of the crystal, because they only have other neighbor atoms on one side and not on the other. And so that's kind of why these are interesting things to study. There are on our campus a number of these scanning tunneling microscopes. I like to emphasize that, this is a university where we have all of the tools that might pop up as being describing experiments that we see. I'm also responsible for an upper level chemistry lab that just chemistry majors take, but they actually do an experiment where they work with one of these microscopes and take images at least a bit like the one of the silicon there on the right-hand side. All right, for now, what we want is just a simple picture of atoms, just a few details to make sure everybody's on the same page. And I know a lot of you, most of you have been taught a lot of the things that are going to pop by here in earlier tiers of schooling, but it's important to get some reminders. So atoms are made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons. That's the next layer down in our hierarchy of matter, right? Atoms are strange because almost all the mass lives in the nucleus of the atom, and yet that nucleus takes up almost none of the volume of the atom, okay? The nucleus contains the protons and the neutrons. Protons and neutrons have the same mass as one another, and they are both, on the order of 10,000 times heavier than electrons, and so the mass is almost entirely in that nucleus, okay? The electrons surround the nucleus. We're not going to talk about how just yet. When we get to chapter 6, we'll spend a couple weeks talking about details of how we now envision the structure of atoms, all right? Protons have a positive electrical charge, electrons have a negative electrical charge. Those charges are equal and opposite. And so we usually just count them in units as if that thing was a unit of charge. So if I say something has a +1 charge, that means it's got 1 extra proton, say, or -1 would mean it has 1 extra electron. Neutrons are neutral. They have no electrical charge. That's where the name neutron comes from, okay? The picture on the screen there is a so-called Bohr model of an atom. It's aluminum. I know it's aluminum because the green dots represent 13 electrons around that nucleus, and 13 electrons is the number that goes with an aluminum atom. That picture is based on a model which is frankly not correct, okay? And so we don't want to get too deeply bought into the idea of electrons whizzing around on little paths like planets going around a sun or anything like that. Pictures like that are always invariably not to scale, because it's literally impossible to draw an atom and be able to see the nucleus and not have it take up too much of the space, okay? So that picture greatly overemphasizes the size of the nucleus. If we made the nucleus to the scale of where those electrons are, it would be invisible on our screen. And so that's the way we depict that. And in that picture, I don't know, we could take the, say, the red ones as being the protons and the blue ones as being the neutrons. I suppose it doesn't make too much difference because we can't really count them anyway. Okay, but that's all we're going to need to know about atoms right now is the protons and the neutrons are in the nucleus, the electrons are somehow swirling around it, and we have our electrical charge information. Chemistry is based on, nowadays, on what is known as the atomic theory of matter, sometimes called Dalton's atomic theory of matter, right? It says that all matter is composed of atoms. That could perhaps say all matter that is at least as big as the scale of atoms is composed of atoms, okay? Atoms of a given element have identical chemical properties, and atoms of different elements have different chemical properties. Those two things together mean we can tell them apart, right? If we do the right experiments, we can find out what element a given atom happens to be. And there are a lot of different ways we could do that, but those things are important to our understanding. It means that we can distinguish one element from another. Atoms combine to form molecules, and when they do that, they do it in whole number ratios, okay? So that says, you're all familiar with the idea that water is H2O, right? We're not gonna see any formulas where something is H2.3O or anything like that, right? They're whole number ratios, and that's because atoms can't be subdivided, right? I can't have a fraction of an atom, and so I can't have a fraction of an atom appear in a molecule, really. Lastly, it says their atoms are conserved. They're not created or destroyed in ordinary chemical reactions, and they're not interconverted between one element and another, again, in ordinary chemical reactions. The ordinary chemical reactions disclaimer there means I'm explicitly ruling out nuclear reactions here, okay? My wife actually is a nuclear chemist. She is the director of the Cyclotron Institute on campus. And so I totally recognize the idea that there are nuclear reactions. That's what she studies, and the people in her facility work on. Nuclear reactions are important in lots of applications, but for the purposes of our course, we're gonna wall ourselves off from that topic. If you're interested in the idea of nuclear reactions, there is chapter 14 at the back of your textbook actually deals with nuclear chemistry, and you could check that out sometime if you are just curious about that, because it is a topic that is just really interesting to a lot of people. But for our purposes, we're going to say that however many carbon atoms I start with, for example, that's got to be how many carbon atoms I end up with. In our periodic table, we have here a sample square. This one is one that would be carbon, obviously. And periodic tables come in a lot of varieties. They have more or less information in them. In this case, this is a fairly minimalist one. This is about the smallest set of information you'll see. So I've got here, I've got my symbol, the C, in the center of my box. That just tells me this is carbon that I'm looking at, all right? Those symbols, if somebody in high school made you memorize a long list of all those symbols, I apologize for that on behalf of chemistry. There's no real need to do that. You will become familiar with a lot of the common ones, and a lot of the common elements are pretty obvious, right? Carbon is C, nitrogen is N, oxygen is O, and so on. Some of the obscure ones, the ones that seem like they don't make sense, those usually come from the name of the element in other languages. Like lead is Pb, and that's for plumbum, which is the Latin word for lead. And so there's ways to explain all the sort of obscure seeming symbols from those. Up here in the corner, we have what is known as the atomic number, which for carbon happens to be 6. That says a carbon atom would have 6 protons, and it would have 6 electrons. I'm just going to write an E- for my electrons, so I don't have to write that out, okay? And down here at the bottom, we've got what is known as the atomic weight, which for carbon happens to be 12.011. And we'll talk more about what that number means in terms of units and things like that in a moment, and then again in another couple of days or two. So we'll just go from there. You'll also see some periodic tables that might have other things buried in the box, right? Some of them show things like what kind of crystal structure, or sometimes something called electronegativity that we'll learn about later in the semester. There's a variety of other bits of information that could be in there, but those are the basics. So that atomic weight, the 12.011 for carbon, atoms do have measurable masses, and we'll look in a second at how we can measure them. It's obviously not the same as just putting something on a scale or a balance, right? What we call the atomic weight for an element is the average mass of an atom of that element, okay? It feels weird to put average there because we said that atoms of a given element have identical chemical properties, right? It turns out those chemical properties are based on how many protons and electrons the atom has. Those are both equal to the atomic number, right? But the neutrons, because there's no electrical charge on the neutrons don't really influence the chemical properties. And so different atoms of a particular element, there's what are called isotopes, which we'll talk about in a separate video, but those isotopes have different numbers of neutrons in them, and that's why the atomic weight is an average. The common units for an atomic weight are, as it says here, the AMU, that's atomic mass unit, okay? This is also sometimes called a Dalton, and it sometimes is written with the symbol U. So if you see those, recognize that's just an AMU, okay? I'll usually write AMU because I'm kind of old school about that, and that's what we used to call them. And so that's kind of what I'll go with. This is a conversion factor, right? It just says that 1 AMU is equal to 1.66 times 10 to the minus 27 kilograms. That's a really small mass. That's convenient because we want a unit that's good for weighing atoms, right? Notice that 12.011 for carbon, that's the average mass of 1 carbon atom in AMUs. Okay, if I reported that number in kilograms, this thing in front of me tells me that would end in a 10 to the minus 26 kilograms. Humans in general don't like working with numbers that have very large or small powers of 10 attached to them. And so we usually choose units that get rid of those. And so that's why the atomic mass unit is chosen, so that the masses of the elements in those AMUs go from 1 to a couple hundred. Okay, so they're nice numbers for a human brain to deal with. We're going to do our very first calculation of the semester, I guess, to wrap this up. And that is, we're going to find the average mass of a carbon atom in grams, okay? I'm going to be given the idea that the atomic weight of carbon is 12.011 AMU, which I got from my periodic table, and the conversion factor that's on the screen right now, which I could look that up if I didn't happen to know it, right? I don't expect you to memorize things like that unit conversion. There's no need for that, all right? You can look them up if you're doing problems. If you're taking an exam, you'd be given information like that that you might need, okay? So let's calculate the mass of a carbon atom. What we know is that we have 12.011 AMUs. And really what I want to know is that's equal to how many grams? That's the summary of my question, okay? The other thing I know is I know that 1 AMU is equal to the number that was just on there, 1.66. I'm going to write 06 because that's what I've got in front of me in the notes that I have, times 10 to the minus 27th. And that's in kilograms, okay? So this is what I'm going to do. When I do this calculation, I always want to start with the thing I know. The quantity I know right now is I know that I have 12.011 AMUs. So that's my first thing in my calculation. All right, and we're going to do this just like I demonstrated in the unit conversion segment. I want to get rid of AMUs, so I take my unit factor, my conversion factor, I put the AMU on the bottom, and I put that 1.66 times 10 to the minus 27th kilograms on the top. Okay, I'm in kilograms now, but I want to get to grams. I could stop there if I wanted, and if you're lacking in confidence doing these, you might want to stop periodically and say, now I've got this intermediate result. I didn't write it down up here, but I happen to know, and most of you probably happen to know, that 1 kilogram, kilo is 1,000, so that means this is 1,000 grams. Okay, and if I multiply all that out, my notes sitting next to me tell me I get 1.9945 times 10 to the minus 23rd grams. Okay, my check to see if that number makes any sense really in this case corresponds to just looking at it and saying it's a really small number. Okay, it's the mass of an atom, right? So it should be quite tiny. A gram is a fairly small mass. If you had a gram of some substance sitting on your fingertip, it would fit on your fingertip for a lot of things, and it wouldn't be that much, right? But this is just one atom, so getting a very small number means there's a good chance that I've done things correctly. If, for example, I hadn't written down my units and I had taken, say, this piece here and done it upside down, then I would have divided by that 10 to the minus 27. That would have given me an enormous number for an answer, which would in turn have triggered me to slap myself on the head and say I did something stupid and go back and hopefully find that mistake. All right, so that's a really simple unit conversion, but it's gets us on track for starting to think about just how small atoms really are.